Winter came early to the lands of the Rus. By the final weeks of 1240, the Dnieper River moved slowly beneath a tightening crust of ice, its dark currents carrying silence through the valleys below Kiev. Frost clung to wooden walls and church domes. Smoke from hearth fires drifted low, heavy in the cold air. The city stood ancient and proud, once the center of a thriving political and spiritual world. But now it waited, not for trade, not for diplomacy, for something far more final. Far to the east, beyond forest and steppe, a different kind of army was already in motion, disciplined, relentless, and methodical in a way the Rus had never fully understood. They did not move like the fragmented forces of Europe. They did not argue, delay, or hesitate. Every campaign they began ended the same way, with a slow suffocation of resistance, followed by total destruction. The Mongols were coming, and Kiev, whether it understood it or not, had already been marked. The political world of the Rus in the early 13th century was no longer unified. What had once been a loose but functioning network of principalities had fractured into rival centers of power. Princes governed their own cities with limited coordination, often competing for influence, territory, and legitimacy. Kiev, though still symbolically important, was no longer the uncontested heart of this system. Its authority had weakened. Its alliances were uncertain. Its ability to command unified defense almost non-existent. Years earlier, warnings had already reached the Rus lands. Reports filtered in from the east describing cities erased, armies annihilated, entire regions depopulated. At first, these accounts were dismissed or misunderstood. The scale of destruction seemed exaggerated, almost impossible. But then came the first direct encounters. In 1223, a coalition of Rus princes had faced a Mongol force at the Kalka River. What followed was not just a defeat, but a demonstration. The Mongols had drawn the Rus into disorganized pursuit, stretched their formations, and then encircled them with calculated precision. The result was catastrophic. Yet even that lesson failed to produce lasting unity. The princes returned to their rivalries, and the Mongols withdrew. For a time, by the late 1230s, that time had ended. Under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire began a full-scale western campaign. But this was not a raid. It was not reconnaissance. It was a systematic expansion of imperial control, planned, coordinated, and executed with overwhelming force. Cities across the Volga region fell in succession. Ryazan was besieged and destroyed. Vladimir followed, then Suzdal. Each campaign followed a pattern: rapid approach, encirclement, psychological pressure, and then, if resistance persisted, complete annihilation. Survivors carried stories westward. Stories of walls collapsing under strange siege engines, of arrows darkening the sky, of armies that did not break even when outnumbered. Still, Kiev did not act decisively. Its defenses were reinforced. Its population swelled as refugees arrived. But coordination with other Rus princes remained weak. No unified army gathered. No grand strategy emerged. The city prepared to endure a siege. It did not prepare to defeat one. Kiev itself was not an easy target. The city occupied a strategic position along the Dnieper River, with natural elevation providing defensive advantage. Its fortifications, though partly aged, were extensive: wooden walls, reinforced gates, and internal strongholds that could sustain prolonged resistance. The population was large, the defenders numerous. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands within the city, soldiers, militia, and civilians alike. On paper, it was a formidable position. But numbers alone do not define strength. And walls, no matter how thick, cannot compensate for disunity. As the Mongol advance continued westward, their approach toward Kiev was deliberate. They did not rush blindly into confrontation. Instead, they isolated targets, cut off communication routes, and ensured that no relief forces could effectively organize. By the time Kiev fully understood the immediacy of the threat, it was already alone. The surrounding territories had been subdued or bypassed. Nearby stronghold had either fallen or withdrawn into silence. The Mongols had done what they always did before a decisive strike. They had removed every external variable. Now, only the city remained. Inside Kiev, leadership fell to Prince Danilo's appointed commander, Dmitry, a man tasked not with winning a field battle, but with holding a city against an enemy whose methods were still only partially understood. His situation was defined by constraint. He could not rely on reinforcements. He could not break the siege once it began. His only option was endurance, but endurance against the Mongols required more than supplies and walls. It required an understanding of how they fought, how they thought, and how they adapted, and that understanding was incomplete. The Mongols, meanwhile, approached with clarity of purpose. Their army, though smaller in raw numbers compared to the defenders within Kiev, operated as a unified machine. Each unit was structured, each commander experienced, each movement calculated. They did not depend on overwhelming numbers. They depended on control of terrain, of timing, and of the enemy's decisions. Their strength lay not just in combat, but in orchestration. They studied their targets. They exploited weaknesses. And when necessary, they waited. By late 1240, their forces had reached the outskirts of Kiev. The final phase had begun. There was no immediate assault. That, in itself, was part of the pressure. The Mongols established positions around the city, cutting off access routes and observing defensive patterns. Scouts moved constantly, mapping terrain, identifying weak points in the fortifications, and assessing response times from within the walls. This was not hesitation. It was preparation. Every hour that passed tightened the noose. Inside the city, tension grew. The defenders knew what had happened to other cities that resisted. They understood, at least in part, what failure meant. Yet there was also a belief, perhaps fragile, perhaps desperate, that Kiev could hold where others had fallen. The walls still stood. The numbers were still on their side. And winter, harsh and unforgiving, seemed like potential ally. But the Mongols had campaigned through worse. Cold did not slow them. If anything, it simplified the battlefield. Frozen ground allowed for stable movement of heavy equipment. Rivers became roads, and siege operations could continue without interruption. The strategic reality was already shifting. Kiev was no longer a center of decision-making. It had become a fixed point in the Mongol campaign, a target to be processed. Its fate would not be determined by its history, or its symbolic importance, or even the courage of its defenders. It would be determined by a series of decisions made under pressure. Decisions about when to defend, when to counter, when to conserve strength, and when, if ever, to abandon positions. The Mongols would force those decisions, one by one. As their encirclement tightened, the psychological dimension of the siege began to take shape. Messengers sent out from Kiev failed to return. Outlying watch posts went silent. Refugees who had once brought warnings had stopped arriving, not because the threat had passed, but because there was nowhere left to flee from. The city was sealed, and outside its walls, an army of 12,000 waited with patience that felt almost unnatural. They did not shout. They did not rush. They prepared. What Kiev faced was not simply an enemy at the gates. It faced a system, one that had already dismantled larger forces, stronger alliances, and more strategically positioned cities. The question was no longer whether the Mongols could take Kiev. It was whether Kiev could delay the inevitable long enough to matter. Inside the walls, men took their positions along the fortifications. Weapons were inspected, supplies rationed. Orders passed quietly through the ranks. There was no panic, not yet, but beneath the surface, uncertainty spread, because this was not a war they recognized, and the enemy waiting beyond the frozen fields had no intention of fighting it on familiar terms. The siege had not yet begun, but the outcome was already taking shape. The first visible signs of escalation came not with movement, but with structure. Across the frozen ground surrounding Kiev, the Mongol encampment began to change. What had initially appeared as a loose ring of cavalry formations gradually reorganized into something more deliberate. Units were redistributed. Lines of approach were cleared. Supply points were established at measured intervals. Nothing was improvised. The army of Batu Khan had entered its operational phase. This force, often described simply as 12,000, was not defined by its size, but by its composition. Each man was part of a decimal system of command, tens, hundreds, thousands. Every officer understood his role within a larger structure that extended beyond immediate visibility. Orders moved quickly, without confusion, and more importantly, without contradiction. The Mongols did not rely on mass to create pressure. They relied on synchronization. At the center of this system stood Batu Khan, not merely as a figure of authority, but as a coordinator of momentum. His command style reflected the broader Mongol doctrine: avoid unnecessary losses, isolate the enemy, and apply force only when the outcome had already been shaped. He was supported by experienced generals, men who had spent years campaigning across vastly different terrains, from the forests of Eastern Europe to the deserts of Central Asia. They understood siege warfare not as a static contest, but as a dynamic process of dismantling resistance layer by layer. And Kiev would be approached no differently. Inside the city, the defensive structure was far less unified. Command fell to Dmitry, a voivode appointed in the absence of Prince Danilo. His authority was recognized, but not absolute. Kiev's defenders were a mixture of trained soldiers, local militia, and armed civilians, each with varying levels of discipline and experience. Their strength lay in numbers. Their weakness lay in coordination. The city's fortifications, though extensive, reflected an earlier era of warfare. Wooden walls, reinforced with earthworks, surrounded key sections of the city. Towers provided vantage points, and gates were fortified with heavy timber and iron fittings. But these defenses had been designed to repel raids, not withstand a prolonged and technologically sophisticated siege. The Mongols understood this, and they intended to exploit it. The battlefield itself was defined as much by climate as by construction. Winter had hardened the terrain into a stable, unforgiving surface. Snow covered much of the ground, but beneath it, the earth was solid, ideal for the movement of siege equipment. The Dnieper River, partially frozen, no longer acted as a natural barrier. Instead, it provided an additional axis of movement for forces willing to take the risk. Visibility was limited. Sound carried differently in the cold. Every movement, whether by defender or attacker, left traces. For the Mongols, this environment simplified reconnaissance. For the defenders, it removed unpredictability. There were no hidden approaches, no sudden reinforcements, only the slow, visible tightening of pressure. The first stage of engagement was indirect. Mongol archers advanced in control formations, testing the defensive response of the city. They remained outside effective counterattack range, releasing volleys designed not to inflict heavy casualties, but to provoke reaction. And reaction came. From the walls, Rus defenders returned fire, less coordinated, less precise, but driven by urgency. Arrows struck shields, armor, and wood. Some found their targets. But the exchange was not equal. The Mongols rotated their units, maintaining constant pressure while minimizing fatigue. Their composite bows, designed for power and accuracy, allowed them to engage from distances the defenders struggled to match. More importantly, they observed every response from the walls, every concentration of defenders, every delay in reinforcement was noted. This was not yet an attack. It was measurement. As days passed, the nature of the engagement shifted. Behind the lines of archers, engineering units began their work. Siege engines, transported across vast distances and assembled on-site, were brought forward in stages. These included traction trebuchets and other mechanical devices capable of launching projectiles over the city walls. Their construction was methodical, their placement calculated. Each engine was positioned to target specific sections of the fortifications, areas identified as structurally weaker or less effectively defended. When they began to fire, the psychological effect was immediate. Stones and incendiary projectiles arced through the cold air, striking walls, rooftops, and internal structures. The sound of impact, with splintering, earth-shifting, echoed across the city. For the defenders, this represented a new phase. The walls were no longer a passive barrier. They had become a target. Dmitry's response was constrained but deliberate. Repair crews were organized to reinforce damaged sections of the wall. Fires were contained where possible. Archers were repositioned to disrupt the operation of siege engines. But each of these actions required movement, and movement exposed weakness. The Mongols adjusted their fire accordingly. Where defenders concentrated, projectiles followed. Where repairs began, bombardment intensified. The defenders were no longer dictating the pace of engagement. They were reacting to it. Meanwhile, Mongol cavalry units maintained a wider perimeter, ensuring that no breakout attempts could succeed. Patrols moved continuously, intercepting any individuals attempting to leave or enter the city. Isolation was complete. Inside Kiev, resources began to strain, not immediately, but perceptibly. Food supplies, though initially sufficient, required careful distribution. Water sources remained accessible, but the risk of contamination from bombardment increased. More critically, morale began to shift. The defenders had expected an assault. What they encountered instead was a process, a gradual erosion of their defensive capacity. Every day, the walls weakened. Every night, repairs struggled to keep pace. Sleep became irregular. Command decisions became reactive. The Mongols, by contrast, maintained rhythm. Their operations followed a pattern: harassment, observation, bombardment, adjustment. There was no urgency in their actions, no wasted motion. They were not attempting to overwhelm the city in a single strike. They were preparing it for collapse. One of the key tactical objectives emerged clearly as the siege progressed: the gates. Though heavily reinforced, the gates represented a structural vulnerability. Unlike the continuous stretches of wall, they concentrated defensive pressure into specific points. The Mongols began to focus their efforts accordingly. Siege engines adjusted their targeting. Archers increased pressure on gate-adjacent towers. Engineering unit prepared for closer engagement. This included the construction of protective structures, mantlets, and siege screens that allowed attackers to approach the walls with reduced exposure to defensive fire. These developments were visible from within the city, and they carried a clear implication. The distance between observation and assault was closing. Dmitry faced a narrowing set of options. A sortie, an attempt to disrupt the siege from outside, was theoretically possible. The defenders had the numbers to attempt it, but such an operation required coordination, speed, and a clear objective. Against an enemy that excelled in open-field maneuver, the risks were extreme. Failure would not only cost lives, it would accelerate the collapse of the city's defensive structure. He chose to hold, to absorb, to delay. As the siege entered its later stages, the Mongols intensified their efforts. Bombardment increased in frequency. Targeting became more precise. Sections of the wall began to show visible degradation: cracks, shifts, partial collapses. These were not yet breaches, but they were approaching that threshold. Inside Kiev, the defenders adapted as best they could. Secondary defensive positions were established behind weakened walls. Barricades were constructed within the city, creating fallback points in case of penetration. But each layer of defense came with a cost. Space was reduced. Mobility was restricted. The city, once expansive, began to contract into zones of resistance. The psychological pressure reached a critical point. The defenders could see the progression. They could measure it, and they could do little to stop it. There was no decisive battle, no single moment of engagement where strength could be tested directly. Instead, there was only continuation, a steady, controlled advance toward a point that had not yet been reached, but was no longer uncertain. By early December, the walls of Kiev were no longer intact in their entirety. Sections had weakened to the point where sustained assault would soon be viable. The Mongols had achieved what they required. They had reduced the city's defenses from a unified barrier to a series of vulnerable segments. Now, the nature of the battle would change. The next phase would not be about pressure. It would be about entry. And once that began, the balance that had allowed Kiev to endure would disappear entirely. By the time Kiev reached its final days of resistance, the siege had ceased to resemble a contest between two armies. It had become a controlled dismantling of a city's structural integrity. The Mongol forces no longer needed to test defenses or probe weaknesses. Those stages had already been completed. What remained was execution, precise, timed, and synchronized across multiple points of pressure. Inside the walls, the defenders understood this shift without needing formal declaration. The rhythm of bombardment had changed. The pauses between volleys had shortened. Siege engines were now concentrated on specific sectors rather than distributed across the perimeter. The message was unmistakable. A breach was being prepared. The most critical failure of Kiev's defense was not a single wall section or gate. It was cumulative exhaustion. Weeks of bombardment had not simply damaged wooden oath. They had reshaped the city's defensive logic. Repair crews were depleted. Materials were scarce. The constant movement between damaged sectors had drained coordination. Every reinforcement effort created a gap elsewhere. The defenders were still numerous, but they were no longer concentrated. And in siege warfare, dispersion is collapse in slow motion. When the Mongols finally committed to the assault, they did so with deliberate timing. Multiple breach points were selected in advance. Sections where repeated bombardment had weakened structural cohesion. Siege engines increased fire on these points in the hours leading up to the attack, ensuring maximum instability. Then, without hesitation, forward units advanced. Covered by mobile shields and siege screens, Mongol infantry and auxiliary forces moved toward the walls in tightly controlled formations. Archers continued suppressive fire, targeting defenders attempting to reinforce breach zones. This was not a chaotic charge. It was a coordinated transition from pressure to penetration. The first breach did not announce itself with collapse alone, but with movement. A section of the wall, already compromised by repeated impact, gave way under sustained stress. The structure did not explode outward. It folded inward, dropping earth and timber into the defensive space below. Within moments, Mongol units were inside the outer perimeter. At that instant, the nature of the battle changed irreversibly. The advantage of elevation disappeared. The defensive advantage of walls was gone. Kiev was no longer a fortified position. It was a contested urban battlefield. Dmitri's response was immediate but constrained. Secondary defensive lines, prepared earlier in anticipation of breach, were activated. Streets were blocked with barricades. Narrow passages were converted into choke points. Archers repositioned to fire from elevated buildings and remaining towers. For a brief period, this slowed the Mongol advance. But only briefly. The Mongols adapted almost instantly to the change in environment. Their units split into smaller operational groups, maintaining communication through signals and pre-established coordination patterns. Rather than forcing direct confrontation, they moved to isolate pockets of resistance. Each street became a contained engagement. Each block, a separate operation. The city was being partitioned in real time. The psychological impact on the defenders was severe, not because of sudden panic, but because of fragmentation. Within the same city, different groups experienced entirely different realities. Some held barricades successfully for hours. Others were overrun within minutes. Some never saw the enemy directly before being flanked from multiple directions. Command cohesion broke down not through absence of leadership, but through inability to transmit information across collapsing lines. Orders that left command centers often never reached their intended recipients. And when they did, the situation had already changed. Mongol cavalry, previously held in perimeter roles, now entered the city environment where possible, exploiting open corridors and broken terrain to prevent regrouping. Their mobility allowed them to appear unexpectedly in rear positions of defensive lines, accelerating disorientation among Rus defenders. At the same time, infantry units pressed forward methodically, clearing resistance step by step. There was no attempt to rush the entire city at once. Instead, pressure was applied continuously, preventing stabilization anywhere. As the day progressed, Kiev's internal structure began to fail as a defensive system. What had once been a unified stronghold had become a series of isolated resistance pockets. Churches, halls, and fortified residences became last points of defense. But each one was surrounded, each one slowly reduced. The defenders fought with increasing desperation, but also increasing isolation. There was no front line anymore, only shrinking circles of control. Dmitri himself was no longer commanding a single battlefield. He was attempting to coordinate fragments of one. Reports became inconsistent. Messengers failed to return. Communication routes collapsed under shifting control of streets and intersections. At some point, command transitioned from strategic decision-making to localized survival management. This is the final stage of any siege. When leadership can no longer shape the battle, only witness its conclusion. By late stages of the assault, organized resistance outside of strongpoints had largely ceased. The Mongols continued their systematic approach, moving through the city in controlled sweeps. Resistance was engaged, neutralized, and bypassed where necessary. Their objective was no longer just military victory, it was full control of urban space. Kiev's size, once an advantage, now accelerated its fragmentation. Distance became isolation. Isolation became vulnerability. Eventually, Even the strongest remaining defensive positions began to fall, not through sudden collapse, but through cumulative pressure. Exhaustion, lack of coordination, and continuous encirclement eroded their ability to sustain resistance. One by one, key centers were reduced. The defenders who survived did so not as a unified army, but as scattered remnants within a collapsing urban landscape. When the fighting finally subsided, it did not end with a single moment of resolution. It ended with absence. The sound of coordinated resistance diminished. Movements across major sectors stopped. Only isolated engagements remained, gradually fading as control consolidated. Kiev had fallen. The aftermath was not immediate reconstruction, but silence under occupation. The Mongols, following their established patterns, secured the city systematically. Remaining resistance was eliminated or dispersed. Strategic points were controlled. Routes were monitored. But the deeper consequence was not only physical destruction. It was structural collapse of regional power perception. Kiev, once a symbolic and political center of the Rus world, had been proven unable to withstand a concentrated Mongol siege, even with vastly superior numbers inside its walls. The disparity between forces, approximately 12,000 Mongol troops against a defensive population that may have reached tens of thousands, revealed a central truth of the campaign. This was not a war decided by manpower. It was decided by organization, adaptability, and operational doctrine. The Mongols did not win because they were everywhere at once. They won because they were never disorganized.